the air with breaking news. A second state now facing down Hurricane Ian as it barrels through South Carolina. We're going to show you the live pics we're getting from Myrtle Beach, and you'll hear from folks who lost everything in Florida, where we are covering every angle, from gators swimming down Orlando's streets to the horrific images we're seeing in Fort Myers, where boats are on land, cars are underwater, and rescues are just starting. President Biden doing what he can as he says what's happening in Florida is an American crisis. We've got more on how what we're seeing right now is something we don't get a lot of at the moment: cooperation, for now, among political rivals. Plus, Ian is one of the strongest storms to ever hit Florida. So we take a closer look at how climate change is only going to make future hurricanes even worse. Plus, a look at the people who stayed behind, some because they wanted to, some because they had to, as the storm destroyed their homes. That's coming up a little bit later in the show. Hey, I'm Hallie, and as we speak right now tonight, Hurricane Ian is making a second landfall in South Carolina. It is slamming into Charleston just in the last couple hours. This is the live radar. Look at this now. You can see this storm moving its way past the coast with winds up to 85 miles an hour in some spots. Storm surges could get as high as 7 feet. And so now Ian's going to curve up into North Carolina before spraying rain across the Appalachians. Check out the live look that we can see from some of these spots: Southport, North Carolina, Myrtle Beach as well. The big concern, these cities are really close to sea level. OK, there's a lot of loose soil there. That means that flooding is a concern, too. That is what people are watching for, even as the governor says, hey, you know, this storm may not be as bad as you thought. You cannot let your guard down now. All of that happening as we're watching Florida, where President Biden says America's heart is breaking.
It's not just a crisis for Florida. This is an American crisis. We're just beginning to see the scale of that destruction. It's likely to rank among the worst of the nation's and the worst in the nation's history.
At least 14 people are confirmed dead, and that number is expected to get even higher, with officials sorting through a big backlog and 911 calls. You can see some of what they're dealing with here, right? I mean, sticks, houses that are sticks. 2 million people don't have power. 5 counties don't have any running water. And the focus right now is on rescues. This is some Coast Guard video from Sanibel Island. Yeah, that's windy because that guy's being pulled up in a helicopter right now. That's how they're getting people out. Why? Well, check out this aerial video. That was a bridge. Sure, not now, right? There is no way to get in or out. That's why these rescues have to happen from the air. In Orlando, it's flooding that's the big concern. Look at this: cars submerged, paddleboards, people in the streets on those. And the heart of the devastation in places like Fort Myers. One estimate says this could be Florida's most expensive hurricane since Andrew 30 years ago, up to $47 billion in destruction, as some people share the trauma of what it was like to lose everything.
A lot of our friends who had wood-structured homes that wouldn't leave, and I tried to get a hold of them to tell them to come over to my place. Yeah. I watched their houses wash away.
I think I've lost everything I own.
I am 67, lived here 5 years, now it's gone.
We've got it all covered, starting with Kathy Park in Charleston. And right now, Kathy, the rain, not a concern, but high tide is coming in again later on tonight around 11 o'clock. Flooding, I imagine, is the thing people are watching for.
Hallie, yeah. So flooding, localized flooding is still an issue, especially in some downtown roads. We are hearing that dozens of roads are still blocked off, mainly by ponding, just kind of pooling on the roadways, but also debris that is kind of scattered all around the ground. In fact, where we are right now, you can kind of see all the branches and the palm fronds around me. But let me tell you this, Hallie, things have drastically improved. If you talked to me maybe about 2 hours ago, I was getting slammed with heavy bands of rain and wind gusts. So we have seen a big improvement from just a few hours ago. Behind me is the Ashley River, and I can tell you at one point that the sawgrass behind me was completely inundated with water. That water is receding. I can feel the storm kind of pulling away at this point, and it almost, looks like business as usual, aside from all the debris that's kind of scattered around the ground.
I was struck by the governor saying, hey, don't let your guard down yet, even though this storm wasn't as bad as people thought. It certainly wasn't, and it wasn't expected to be the kind of major hurricane that we saw hit in Florida, but it was still serious. This is, present tense, still serious.
Yeah, Hallie, I mean, I was kind of in the thick of it throughout the day today, and I can tell you the winds were ferocious. In some spots throughout the Charleston, we were clocking close to 92-mile-per-hour wind gusts. So this was really serious. There were some water rescues at an island nearby, and the rain was also kind of coming down, downpours, torrential rainfall. But, you know, for the most part, it seems like we're kind of in the clear at this point. But, you know, flash flooding is still a concern. As you mentioned, high tide is set to come in. But for the most part, it seems like everyone kind of hunkered down. Officials are saying that they didn't have to do as many rescues as originally thought. A lot of folks here, this is the low country for a reason, right? So even on a good day when it's sunny, when there is high tide, there is some localized flooding. But we kind of dodged a bullet in many ways, because at one point, because of the timing of all this, we were anticipating potential a collision course of high tide, storm surge, and potential landfall here in Charleston. But fortunately, none of that really materialized. But of course, we're still monitoring that spotty localized flooding in the area. Hallie?
Makes sense. Kathy Park starting us off tonight live in Charleston, South Carolina, as Ian is passing over. I want to bring in Bill Cairns now, because we can no longer call it a hurricane,
right.
Ian. Bill, from the latest update we're getting in just moments ago from the National Hurricane Center.
Yeah, none of us are upset about that, right? It's done.
Right.
There'll never be another Hurricane Ian. This name will 100% be retired, because the names recycle every 5 years, by the way. But if they're really bad, they retire them, and obviously this is one of the worst ever. So there'll never be another Hurricane Ian. So it's post-tropical is what we call it. The reason we say that, it's not tropical in nature anymore. Now it's like a big nor'easter coming up the coast. Still could cause problems, of course.
So,
and
I'm sorry, but let me just make sure I'm clear. So it's not a tropical storm. Its name is post-tropical Ian.
Yes, correct. It'd be post-tropical storm Ian is what people would call it. So yeah, winds are still of 70 miles per hour. It's just you know, characteristics of the nature of the storm. It's no longer coming from the warm tropics. It's kind of, that's the reason they do it. But that's more technical than anyone wants to hear. So let's get into the problems with the storm. The Hurricane Center has this completely dissipating into just a remnant low by the time we get to Saturday afternoon. So we're no longer tracking it. There's no reason to do that. The winds haven't been that bad. That's why we haven't heard about horrific power outage numbers. Yes, they did have gusts to 92 miles per hour in the Charleston area. That's the area that had the highest wind gusts with the storm. Everyone else has been in the 40 to 50 mile per hour range. Raleigh-Durham Airport just gusted to 47. So there's going to be some down trees. If you have an old tree that's maybe rotting anyways, and this was the wind that came and took it down on the power lines, that's the kind of stuff we're going to see. I don't think we're not going to see any devastation with that. So the life-threatening weather that's left would be flash flooding. And we still have a flood watch that includes areas from Charleston to Raleigh, the mountains of Virginia, the Norfolk, Virginia Beach, the Hampton Roads area. That is under a flash flood warning. So there is still life-threatening weather out there, and it's mostly going to be because of water and the rain, whatever happens the rest of today. So we're going to take this storm northwards, and there is still a chance of isolated tornadoes, too. I don't want to forget that potential. We haven't had any today, but until 10 o'clock tonight, eastern North Carolina, southeast Virginia is under a tornado watch. And here's the timing of this, Hallie, for you. So here's D.C., rain moving in over the next couple hours. Heaviest rain over the next 2 to 4 hours, Raleigh to Charlotte. Then as you wake up tomorrow morning, it should be pouring in areas like New York City, Long Island, southern Connecticut. And then the storm kind of breaks in two pieces. So that piece of heavy rain exits, and then we have some leftover rain in West Virginia with the actual remnant low. Sunday's a little bit better than Saturday in the Mid-Atlantic. It's going to be a little less windy. So if you don't have any outdoor plans this weekend, Sunday's your better choice than doing it on Saturday. But no damage out here at all. And whatever repairs we need to make from that storm surge in areas of South Carolina, they'll have plenty of time to do that tomorrow as the weather does improve. And Hallie, we haven't seen the pictures yet. We don't want to be like, oh, nothing happened. I know that around Paradise Island and also around Georgetown area heading northwards up towards southern portions there of the Myrtle Beach, there was a storm surge of about 6 feet. And that was the second highest they've ever recorded. I know one pier was smashed and is no longer there anymore. So there is damage. And we'll get those pictures in tomorrow to see how bad it was in those areas. It's no Southwest Florida, obviously. This was a Category 1.
Different hurricane.
Right. This is a Category 1. That's the difference between a 1 and a 4.
Bill Cairns, thank you so much. I want to Rosenblum, who lives in Murrells Inlet, South Carolina. Michael, I'm so glad that you're with us. Thank you. And I want to show folks some video you sent to our team earlier of what it had looked like outside your house. We're going to pull that up, and I'm going to ask you, I mean, that's a lot of water getting real close to where you live, if not underneath where you live. Tell me what you're seeing right now.
Yeah, now, thanks, Hallie. All looks good now, but that was pretty scary. We went from having no water in the yard to about 18 inches under the house in about an hour. Somewhat unexpected based on the reports that were coming out as prior.
Well, tell me about that, because it wasn't until the storm hit Florida, right, that we really had an idea that it could make landfall number 2, as it did today in South Carolina. I know you made the decision to stay, right?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the storm the entire time kept tracking east of the predictions. And, we talked about leaving last night, but, again, we thought we had been through a few Cat 1s before, and, our house is 12 feet up higher. So we felt we were safe, but we almost lost a few cars today, for sure.
I also want to make sure people understand your house is raised, right? So you're up on stilts, for lack of a better phraseology there.
Yeah,
which is why you got water under the house. Yeah. Correct.
So that was all under the house. We're fortunate. Certainly, there's a lot of folks a lot less fortunate than us that aren't raised up, and it's going to be a heck of a cleanup.
You worried about high tide at all? That's going to happen in a few hours. What's your plan here?
Yeah, no, I think this tide should be fine. It was just a terrible timing of the wind and the high tide here that caught us all off guard.
Michael Rosenblum,
even
thank
though
you so
we've been
much.
through it so many times.
I was going to say, you're no stranger to this kind of thing. As you said, you've been through a couple of Cat 1 hurricanes before, with Ian now a post-tropical storm, as we just heard from our meteorologist, Bill Cairns. Mike, thank you. Over in Fort Myers, down in Florida, that is where the real ferocious strength of this Category 4 hurricane has been felt after Ian made landfall there a couple days ago. So what's happening now? People are starting to sift through the absolute destruction left behind, trying to figure out, hey, how much damage was done? And like when you look at these images, you'll see them. Like, look at that there. That is a plaza, basically. It's sticks, it's pieces of lumber now. It's typically bars and restaurants, people out on vacation, et cetera. It's just wreckage everywhere. Trees knocked down, everything mixed together. And look at some of these boats. They're pushed so far on shore that they ended up in somebody's house, right? That's happening up and down the coast there. One city manager today telling me it's going to be a marathon, not a sprint, to get this all cleaned up, warning of some real challenges ahead. And the head of Lee County here also saying there's just no water available. People here just don't have running water. It's obvious why. Look at that boat. There's a marina across the road, okay? That's how the force of this hurricane was. Picked up that boat, pushed it across the street. People don't have power either. Nearly 2 million folks across Florida, 2 million customers have no electricity. Steve Patterson is in Fort Myers and joins us now. And this is hard to watch. Some of these pictures out of Fort Myers, way harder to watch for the people whose homes and lives were there.
Incredibly hard to watch, because everything you see was a part of somebody's life, and you have to understand that as you walk through the wreckage. So I can do that, and I can see, this probably looked like a tool room or something like that, power saws, some wrenches, something like that. But everything is mixed in with this incredible force that must have hit this area, and we know did hit this area, because everything is so uprooted. Not only is it just scattered items, but it's also, parts of the dock in the marina that you were just talking about have come off and stripped this whole area. There's huge concrete chunks that have lopped off in this area as well. Up above my left, as I keep walking, you'll see people are throwing some of their items down from the second floor. That's not a roof, that's somebody's second floor. You can see the shower. You should see the shower stall in there. That's the only thing that is standing up there, besides the people that, as you mentioned, are now assessing the damage, doing the heartbreaking work of trying to determine what the loss is. I imagine that is a total loss. If you come down here, you can see this is asphalt. This used to be where people would walk right along this path. It's gone. So the extent of the damage is something that is incalculable at this point. And I think, first of all, obviously, search and rescue is still going on, especially when you talk about some of these channel. Yeah, I mean, look, we've heard helicopters the entire time we've been here. The street that I can't show you, it's a little too far over, but it's got all of those yachts and boats that are from this marina next to it. Well, power trucks are going through there. Emergency vehicles are going through there. High above, helicopters are above us, because there are a few of those barrier islands that still have people stranded after the channel was lopped off, essentially, by all that wind and by that destructive force, meaning that there is no access by land. The only way you can get there is by helicopter and by boat. And so rescues are terribly difficult when you're dealing with a situation like that, especially with the fact that all of this wreckage is strewn everywhere. Imagine even trying to ride a boat right now in some of this shallow water must be so difficult and so dangerous. And also there are power lines down everywhere as well. So the whole city, you know, I don't want to use a cliche, but it's like a bomb went off. And it's like in many ways the fuse is still going, because there are still people that possibly are trapped on those islands. There still may be people in some of this wreckage. And there is this huge battle, which is a marathon and not a sprint, although they're trying to do it as fast as they can to clean up, to assess the damage, to find people, to get power back on. All of that is going to take so long. And in some cases, it has to happen quicker than people would like, because there may still be people in it. So a lot of work to do. It's heartbreaking to see, and you can see the results of that. I've been speaking to people about coming back to see essentially nothing. This is a wasteland. I cannot impress that upon you enough. And it's so terrible to walk through. Hallie?
I was talking with the head of one of the hospital systems there in Lee County, who was telling me 2 of their hospitals are evacuating patients today, 28 sick babies, newborns, under the age of 28 days old. So literally weeks-old babies, 48 of them had to be evacuated. They had 11 more to go because some of these hospitals have no running water. They have no electricity, running on generators if they can. And that is a microcosm of what else we're seeing around that county, which was hit so hard. And when you think about emergency services, this is what people need. That is just baseline fundamental to this area.
Yeah, you're talking about the evacuation of a NICU, which is like, I don't even know how you do that with how precious life is at that point. I want to plug my guy, Sam Brock. He's doing a story on Nightly News about what you just spoke about. I spoke to him just briefly. He's running around because he's probably got to get that story done. But unbelievable to think about how that even works. So you have about 6 hospitals in this area that don't have running water. So they are sending their patients to other places in the county, in the system, in the state. Luckily, I think a few hospitals are okay. They've been running on generators, or they didn't get directly hit, so they can take patients. And the transfer, you know, as always, when I cover fires, anytime I've covered anything that requires COVID, inner sort of systems where hospitals transfer patients back and forth, it's amazing the cooperation that goes on here when you're talking about the possibility of loss of life or preservation of life. So I have no doubt that they will do everything that they can to make sure that those patients are okay, but I don't know how they're going to do it, especially when you talk about even some of the roads here are impassable because there's so much wreckage on the road. There are boats on the road, Hallie. So I don't know how it's going to get done, but I know the people are dedicated to doing it. Hallie?
I mean, doesn't that say it all, right? Boats in the road and cars in the water, Steve. That's not how it's supposed to be. Steve Patterson, thank you so much. Appreciate it. In Orlando, in the central part of the state, people there, officials saying they got hit bad, but it could have been a whole lot worse. They are in flood recovery mode right now after they got slammed with up to 16 inches of rain, which flooded homes, washed away people's stuff. Thousands of people are now facing tons of money, okay? Think about the expense to fix what was ruined. Some stuff you can't even fix. It was so badly damaged. Crews having to wade through the water early this morning to rescue 120 people at one nursing home. Look at this, in wheelchairs. They had to get them to another facility. Talk about hospitals evacuated. Think about nursing homes, too. Now, parts of Orlando are opening up. The airport is back up and running today. Some of the theme parks, Universal Studios, Disney World, they're starting to phase in their reopenings as they also deal with the damage like what you see on your screen. Schools are hoping to open up by Monday. Jesse Kirsch has more from Orlando.
Here in Orlando, more than 100 miles from where Ian first made landfall, you can still see the destruction is extensive in some areas. This community is partially underwater. Even though it has been dry for hours and the water is receding, there is still a good amount of this neighborhood that is submerged right now. And we have seen an alligator making its way through the waters here. We spoke with one resident who says that this is her home right behind me here. And she says that Hurricane Irma also brought flooding concerns to this neighborhood, and so she knew she was going to evacuate and did so. Thankfully, she says she and her roommates are okay, and she says that their pet rabbit was also rescued. And I asked those residents about flood insurance because they knew that it was a potential issue here they say, after Hurricane Irma, after they saw what happened there. And according to those residents, they say they weren't able to get flood insurance for this property. I asked them if they think there's any way they'll be able to live in this home again, and they do not expect that will be possible.
There's no moving back into that.
This is all we had.
Yeah.
This is everything we worked for. It's gone.
I'm so sorry. Back to you.
Jesse Kirsch with what it is like on the ground there. And think about it, right? Gators aren't even the worst of what's in the water behind those folks. Think about the chemicals, think about any potential sewage, think about any issues from down power lines, et cetera. This is still an active and dangerous scene in some places. I want to bring in now Eric Hooks, FEMA's Deputy Administrator. Mr. Hooks, thank you for being on the show tonight.
Thank you for having me.
I don't know if you heard this last report from my colleague Jesse Kirsch. Flooding is still a concern in a lot of places. We've seen the cleanup in spots like Fort Myers. You've now got what's happening along the Carolina coast. What is the biggest priority, the biggest focus right now for FEMA? What's the most urgent thing?
Well, some of the biggest focus that we have, particularly in Florida, is just to make people realize that we are still in response mode. Just as your previous segment pointed out, there are still a lot of hazards and danger from the water that has not receded in many areas. And we are also very mindful and keeping our eye on South Carolina. Hurricane Ian hit South Carolina at approximately 2:05 p.m. today. And so we are advising individuals to shelter in place. It is a little too late for evacuations at this point, and be very mindful of those hurricane force winds right there at the point of entry into South Carolina, and tropical force winds throughout the middle part of the state of South Carolina as well. So with this storm, it is a wide-ranging storm. It brings a variety of hazards. Storm surge and the accompanying rains could lead to more devastating flooding, and we could see in South Carolina some of the impacts that we've seen in Florida as well.
As you point out, you are still in response mode from the federal perspective, from the FEMA perspective. The recovery mode, though, when you look at people, the rebuilding mode, if you will, is going to be so expensive for so many people who are going to need help, who may not have flood insurance. Some people might have it. The insurance factor here is huge. How do you help people through that, and how can people best get access to resources from the state and federal levels to be able to help them?
Well, we would advise people to do a number of things so that you can seek assistance for the devastation that you have been unfortunately the victim of. We encourage people to download the FEMA app. They can also go onto the website of disasterassistance.gov. And we are also encouraging you to call 1-800-621-3362. That's 1-800-621-3362. So you can seek federal disaster assistance, and so we can begin working with you. We have already, and the number continues to climb, over 30,000 individuals in the Florida area who have applied for disaster assistance, for individual assistance, and we have already begun that process on the long road to recovery.
And just real quick here, Mr. Hooks, for people who don't have cell phone service right now, who can't get online, who don't have computers or internet, folks are going door to door, right, to be able to give this information to folks in areas where it's hardest hit?
Yes, we will initially extend our outreach into the shelters, and then eventually we'll be going door to door, neighborhood to neighborhood, to advise people how they can get disaster help. Now, we pivot to that after we move from response mode.
Makes sense. Eric Hooks, thank you so much, of course, from FEMA, for being there for us here on the show tonight. Appreciate it. That number that he just mentioned, we're going to put all that info up on our socials in like 5 minutes from now, so check it then. You talk about the financial impact from Ian. There is a financial impact we're looking at more widely, not all related, but I want to get to that breaking markets news because it's fairly big. The Dow tumbling 500 points, closing out a rough week for Wall Street. The S&P also hitting a low, down more than 1.5%. That's its worst since early on in the pandemic. The Nasdaq's also down. But today, the last day of the third quarter, and I don't have to tell you, you can see it with your eyeballs. It is a downer that it's ending on. Investors are nervous about what comes next because of the Fed's interest rate hikes to fight inflation, concerns about a recession growing. Caleb Silver is editor-in-chief at Investopedia and joins us now. Not just a bad week for the markets here, but a bad month and a bad quarter. When does it get good again?
Yeah, September to forget for sure. And actually through the first 3 quarters of the year, one of the worst 4 starts in history for the stock market. But the good news is things do get better. October is known as a bear market killer. I'm not saying it's going to go away in October, but you get the feeling with all the bad news piling up that the bad news is priced in. We still have earnings coming up. We could get another leg down here, but we're getting a bad shakeout in the stock market.
How about this inflation report that's coming out today that was closely watched, I should say? We know the Fed looks at it. I mean, inflation is stubborn. That's been the storyline. It doesn't seem to be changing that.
No, it doesn't seem to be changing. This is the Personal Consumption Expenditures Index, the PCE index. The Fed prefers to look at this one because it sort of matches consumer behavior away from food and energy prices, and it's still high, near a 40-year high, up 4.9% year over year. So that's something they're looking at, and until that comes down to around 2% where the Fed wants it, they're going to continue to raise interest rates. Expect several more interest rate increases through the middle of next year at the very least.
Caleb Silver, thank you. Coming up, we're going to take you overseas and bring you more on the storm as well, and take you overseas, where Russia is claiming control over parts of Ukraine. Other countries, the West, calling it an illegal land grab. We're going to have a report from Kyiv. And maybe you missed this, a big reveal from the Education Department over who really is eligible for that student loan relief. We'll have that update in the 5 Things next. We'll get an update on Ian, now a post-tropical storm, in just a couple of minutes, including more on how this particular storm got so bad. But first, today, President Biden is saying the U.S. is not going to be intimidated by President Putin of Russia after Moscow announced they'd be illegally annexing, basically illegally taking over 4 Ukrainian territories. You can see them here. The president adding that the U.S. is never going to recognize these 4 spots that you see at Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia as well. Russia saying this all belongs to them. The West says, no, it doesn't. You took that. You stole it. That doesn't count. And look, Russia doesn't totally control these areas. You see these spots in blue? Those are some areas along the border that Ukraine still holds. But annexation now gives Moscow the ability to call any Ukrainian hit on these eastern areas attacks on Russia. Russia says this move is them answering what people in these places voted on. But remember, they voted in sham referendums. They were fake. People were forced to vote. Some were even held at gunpoint, basically, to cast these ballots, fake ballots. And what we're seeing today from the Kremlin is kind of a replica, pretty much, of a 2014 annexation of Crimea, where we're seeing Putin signing the decree, giving a speech in front of supporters at the Kremlin Palace, followed by an evening concert in the Red Square. Our Jay Gray has more.
Hey there, Hallie. Good evening. And yeah, Vladimir Putin made a speech in Moscow today and says that Russia is now annexing 4 regions of Ukraine. That area makes up about a 1/5 of this country's landmass, and he says that they are now a part of the Russian Federation. That, of course, was met with rebuff here in Kyiv and really from Western leaders across the board saying that it was an illegitimate and illegal annex, that they won't recognize any changes to the border. In fact, today, the president here, Volodymyr Zelensky, pushing forward, he says, with Ukraine's accelerated entry into NATO, making a formal request to be a part of NATO at this point. And as for the fighting, he says the counteroffensive is going to continue, that they are in key locations right now, and some of those areas occupied and annexed by Russia, and now saying that they plan to continue that fight. Hallie?
Jay Gray, thank you. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, the House today passing a bill to keep the government running only for a little bit longer, till mid-December. The president now has until midnight tonight to sign it and avoid a shutdown this weekend. All signs are that's going to happen, no shutdown. The bill also includes money for Ukraine and some money for Afghan refugees, too. Number 2, some new guidelines from the Education Department changes which loans are eligible for that student debt relief program. People with federal student loans that are not held by the Department of Education are shut out. That didn't happen at first. They were included. It's not super clear how many people are going to be affected by this update, but the change comes on the same day that officials from 6 Republican-led states sued to block this debt relief plan. We've reached out to the DOE for comment. We'll keep you posted. Number 3, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson received her formal welcome to the Supreme Court today at what's called her investiture ceremony. The president and the vice president were there, obviously, as you see by this photo. She is the first black woman to serve on the court. The ceremony, remember, totally a formality, purely. She was sworn in back in July. Number 4, it is the end of an era for The Daily Show, with Trevor Noah announcing he's going to be stepping away after 7 years. The show's Twitter posted this video where Noah says the show has been one of the greatest joys, but He feels like it's time. He took over from Jon Stewart way back in 2015. No word yet on his last day or his replacement. Number 5, spooky season is officially here. And what better way to celebrate than with Hocus Pocus 2, released today. If you haven't watched it, I bet I know your Friday night plans. If that's not enough for you, maybe a stay at the now infamous Hocus Pocus cottage is. Airbnb is listing a recreation of the Sanderson sisters' cottage in Danvers, Massachusetts through Halloween season. It is a cult fave. Is it yours? Maybe. Hurricane Ian will go down as one of the strongest storms to ever hit Florida. And if you're thinking, wait a second, these storms seem to be getting more powerful, more intense over the years. Yeah, you're right, they are. Scientists say it's all because of climate change. Watch.
Hurricane Ian slamming Florida, killing more than a dozen people and leaving behind so much damage. And it's not the first time Florida's been hit hard by a major hurricane. Back in 1926, there was the Great Miami Hurricane, the Red Cross, counting nearly 400 people dead, some 6,000 others hurt. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew killed 65 people and destroyed 49,000 homes.
Makes me sick. This is the only thing I ever owned. I don't have anything.
Hurricane Charlie in 2004 made landfall in nearly the exact same place as Ian.
It was just as if the bomb were dropping. That's how it felt.
And more recently, in 2017, Hurricane Irma devastated the southern tip of Florida, killing 34 people. So why does it feel like these hurricanes are only getting worse? Experts point to climate change. NASA data shows the ocean waters off the coast of Florida in the days before Ian made landfall were 2 or 3 degrees warmer than usual.
As the oceans warm due to climate change, that increases the fuel available to power these storms, and the maximum intensity, the strongest they can get, that increases as the climate warms.
And scientists say climate change is making these kinds of hurricanes more intense.
Warmer climate means stronger and wetter storms. And it also means, due to sea level rise, that any storm surge that occurs along the coastline will have a bigger flooding impact because you're starting from a higher level.
A trend that doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon.
In the past decades, we've seen increases in the rates of intensification. As we see more warming in future decades, we expect that hurricanes will get stronger, and especially the strongest storms will get stronger.
Bill Cairns is back with us now to talk more about this climate connection. And Bill, we see it and we hear it, and people in Florida are feeling it, right? Warmer water equals gas, and it has to do with these sea surface temperatures that are fueling these hurricanes.
That is one of the biggest reasons that this one did, and also Michael. And Hallie, we have now had 6 Category 4 or 5 hurricanes make landfall along the Gulf Coast in just the last 6 years. We had Harvey, we had Laura, we had Ida, we had Michael, we had Irma, and now we had Ian. I mean, that is an incredible period of destruction in 6 years. And you were mentioning, here's the path that this one took. And this water, just off of Key West here, and just to the south of Fort Myers, was bath water. I mean, the water temperatures, here's a map that shows you the water temperatures. Typically, to get a hurricane, you need like 80-degree temperatures. It was 83 in the Tampa Bay. South of here, they're estimating it was as warm as 87 degrees. So all hurricanes is they're big engines that redistribute the heat on the planet. During the whole summer, the tropics and the Gulf heat up the Caribbean, and then the hurricane season comes and helps redistribute that energy and that heat across our planet. And this took full advantage of that. And even that little intensification yesterday over the warm Gulf Stream, the waters are above average, and that helped it get up to about 85 miles per hour. And so then, and as you just said in our story, we have peer-reviewed science. So this is science that has been, published, and other scientists have looked at it to see if the data was correct, that we know these hurricanes, some of them, they're moving slower, they're producing more rain, and we're getting more rapid intensification on these storms because of our human influence on the planet. And, this was our 5th strongest landfall we ever had. Now, I had a lot of people from Puerto Rico say, where's Maria? So this is just for the mainland. Maria, by the way, would have been 4th on this list. But Ian comes in 5th after, Camille, Andrew, Michael. And that's not the only story, because I'm hearing crazy numbers for how catastrophic the billions of dollars of damage this storm is going to be. I've heard numbers from 50 to 100, and I just heard another number that was well above 100 that I won't even repeat. So Katrina is the benchmark, and these were all adjusted for inflation. $186 billion weather disaster. That's the costliest weather disaster in our country's history. And some people were saying that we could get up close to that with this storm for the damage they're seeing. Hurricane Harvey was $150 billion. And the thing that I want you to point to before I bore you with all these numbers, Hallie, 2005, 2017, 2017, 2012, 2021. And this is historic. This goes all the way back, and we adjusted these numbers for inflation, too. That's why Andrew was on here at $56 billion from 1992. But you get the fact. We have more people living at the coast. We're building more at the coast. And at the exact same time, now because of how humans are influencing the climate, we're kind of making these hurricanes more dangerous. And so they're going to hit more.
You said something interesting about the rain connection, too, right? It's not just the sheer power of the storm. It's like what happens once they do dump all that water, and there's a climate connection there.
Well, that was the point. I mean, the slower the storm moves, the more it can see. The key with the rain is even a tropical storm moving slowly can dump as much rain as a Category 5 hurricane. It has nothing to do with the intensity of the winds. So, yes, the slow-moving storms are going to do more damage, too.
Bill Cairns, it's a great breakdown. Thank you so much. Not boring in the least, friend. Appreciate it. Let me take it back now to Charleston, where Shaquille Brewster is. And Shaq, the biggest threat. We're talking about water. It is water there where you are. I know you're a little south of where Ian made its second landfall. It's now been downgraded just this hour to a post-tropical storm where you are.
That's exactly right. About 60 miles south of where the landfall actually occurred. But the impact that you see in Charleston is they still had an impact. Now, the mayor told NBC News a little earlier this afternoon that they feel like they dodged a bullet. But this is what dodging a bullet looks like in downtown or in the Charleston area, where you have streets like this, not just in the area we're in, but really throughout the city. I spoke to some locals who did point out that sometimes streets flood like this fairly regularly when they have a storm. But this is much, much higher than they usually see, and they pointed out that this is not going down as quickly as it usually happens with these storms, and that's the threat. I mean, Charleston area got an historic amount of rain over a 24-hour period, according to the National Weather Service. You look at the wind that they were getting; they got about 70-mile-an-hour wind gusts. That was the maximum gusts of wind that they were experiencing, and that led to power outages. People in Charleston area, about 60,000 people are without power currently, according to the energy companies. So they definitely had the impact of this storm, despite them being a little bit of distance away from where the eye of the storm crashed upon the land, Hallie.
Shaq Brewster live there in Charleston, where, as you say, tornadoes are a risk as well. Appreciate it. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day, and because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Southeast Bureau, the Miami Dolphins say QB Tua Tagovailoa will be sidelined indefinitely after a scary moment. Look at this, in a game against the Cincinnati Bengals last night. You may not want to look at it. It's awful. He gets thrown to the ground. He slams his head against the turf. His hands are frozen in front of him. Ugh. He was treated on the field for a couple minutes. He was rushed to the hospital and then released. A lot of people are watching this. It's raising tons of questions about NFL procedures and protocols around concussions, head injuries, etc. We're still on top of that story. Out of our Northeast Bureau, a decision by California regulators is clearing the way for New York to require all new cars and trucks sold there to be zero emission by 2035. Officials are hoping to have a plan for state regulations written up by the end of the year. To help get ready for that, New York is getting $175 million in federal money to expand access to charging stations. And from our West Coast Bureau, gas prices in L.A. County going up overnight by almost 50 cents, which means if you're trying to get a gallon in L.A., it's going to cost you $6.11. $6.11. It's the biggest jump since the summer of 2015. The state's dealing with refinery maintenance issues, making the fuel supply tighter, so that number could go up even more. President Biden today saying he's been in touch with both Republican governors Ron DeSantis of Florida and Henry McMaster of South Carolina, approving their emergency requests for help with Ian leaving behind just catastrophic damage. DeSantis talking with reporters. Look at this. As we've been on the air, just in the last couple of minutes here, he was walking through a neighborhood in St. Augustine to look at some of the damage. He's talking there. We'll show you him walking around and get to more of that in a second. But I want to bring in NBC's Mike Memley, who is following this, because, Mem, this is what I have heard from a lot of people. You and I live in Washington, and so the backdrop to some of what happens, right, nationally is politics. What I've heard from the Democrat who's running against Ron DeSantis, what we've heard from President Biden, other officials, is this is not a time for politics, and it's not. So far, nobody seems to be getting political on this. It is still some of the subtext, but it is not the main text.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. And I really want to talk about what might have been versus what we've actually seen, because a week ago at this time, President Biden was getting ready to travel to Florida. In fact, he was going to go to Orlando to hold a campaign rally with Charlie Crist, who is the Democrat challenging Ron DeSantis in November. And my reporting at the time was that the president was really prepared to turn up the heat on Ron DeSantis, somebody who he really hasn't focused his attention on. There's another Republican former president who lives in Florida that's really been more of a focus for this president. But what have we seen instead? The president now speaking at least 3 times that we know of with the governor and emphasizing today that this is really above politics. This is a moment when we're going to come together as one nation to help one another. And for Governor DeSantis, he has every incentive here to respond just as the president has, because we've seen, especially in the last 2 years, the way Governor DeSantis has really cultivated that conservative base, that MAGA base even. Now this is an opportunity, and this is a moment when what is the right thing to do is also the right thing politically, and he can speak to the rest of the voters in his state, show he's on top of the situation and keeping himself above politics as well.
This is raising some new questions, obviously not in the immediate aftermath of Ian. It's the life, the property damage. That is the key focus here. But I think coming out later, these questions about the governor's position from years ago when he was against aid for those suffering from Hurricane Sandy.
Yeah, this is going to be, I think, a bigger part of the conversation moving forward, because literally just in the last few minutes, Hallie, we got word from the White House. The president has signed that continuing resolution. It's keeping the government open through the next 2 months. But when Congress comes back and has to fund government for a full year, there's going to be some additional money put on the table to help not just Floridians, Puerto Ricans, South Carolinians, others affected by some of these major storms. And I think there will be a greater focus on the fact that a lot of Republicans 10 years ago at this time were standing in the way of federal funding, and Ron DeSantis was a member of the House and was one of them for New York, New Jersey, parts hit hard by Hurricane Sandy, and the hypocrisy here is something that they're going to focus on. But I think you're going to continue to see the president really trying to keep politics out of this, because, Florida has, I think, shifted a little bit more red over the years, but this is a president who also wants to do right by Florida for what might be coming up for him in 2024.
And presidential response matters. We've seen this in disasters past. I think back to Sandy. I think back to other storms as well. I know the White House, I'm sure, is thinking about when does the president go in? How do they handle this?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Hallie. I think the conversation happening today, as the president has really been on top of his staff, trying to get up-to-the-minute details about what the response needs to be, is also about when can I get down there. This is a president who really believes in being there in person. He calls himself a tactile politician. He'll want to see these things firsthand, meet with some of those, show some empathy, as we know he's one to do, and make a trip, not just, by the way, to Florida, but to Puerto Rico as well. Hurricane Fiona still the response efforts going on there as well.
Mike Memley, great point. Live outside the White House for us tonight. Thanks, Mem. Maybe decades ago, some folks were safe to ride out a storm in their homes. But now, because of what we've been talking about, more intense storms because of climate change, sea levels going up, you might not be able to do that anymore. You can't do that anymore. So as storms get bigger, a lot of folks are seeing the need to reconsider how they plan and prepare for storms like Ian. Watch.
2.5 million people in Florida ordered to evacuate because of Hurricane Ian. But getting out of your house for a storm isn't always easy.
The idea of just leaving everything and going off and getting in the highway, and it represents a huge psychological barrier for people to leave.
It's also expensive. Evacuating can cost as much as $5,000. More than 1 in every 10 Floridians lives under the poverty line, and about half of all Americans couldn't cover $1,000 in emergency expenses with savings, according to a recent survey. Plus, gas prices, they they surge before a storm. Traffic backs up for miles, so even a full tank might not be enough. And hotel rooms aren't cheap if they're even available.
My poor brother, he was booked at a hotel and went to go to the hotel, and they had canceled, so he had no place to go.
There's also a psychological hurdle. Weather forecasts can be uncertain, and people can develop a false sense of security or optimism.
Meteorologists talk about storm surge, but it never seems to hit, and so I think that forms a little complacency for us.
And there's herd mentality, too, where you might feel pressure to do what your neighbors are doing.
I don't even think we realized that it was as bad as it was. All of our neighbors that have lived there for 30 years or so were not scared. They said this happens all the time.
We have this collective decision where we feel safety in herds, and so we often decide that we're going to stay with other people.
Having a plan ahead of time is key to being ready for anything, but ultimately the decision to evacuate or not is personal and complicated.
You have a choice. I can either stay put, which is my familiar environment. Whenever you're away, where's the most safe place you can possibly think of to be? But it's your home.
Joining us now is Blaine Alexander in hard-hit Fort Myers, Florida. And as we talked about in our report, you know, if you didn't have to evacuate for past storms, you might have had to now with storms getting stronger. What are you hearing from people?
You know, the bottom line is people did not think it would be this bad. That really is across the board what we've heard. When I've talked to some of our colleagues, that's what they've heard. People just really underestimated the power of Ian. And that's not just here in Fort Myers, by the way. You know, I've been in different cities throughout Florida. When I spoke to people in Orlando, they said the same thing. They said they put down sandbags, didn't think it would flood. The water seeped in anyway, seeped in between the sandbags, over, under, somehow got in and flooded their places. Here in Fort Myers, I spoke to the person who has that business behind me. He tells me that he thought it would be enough to kind of batten down the hatches, essentially, to ground his kayaks and anchor down his boats. That obviously wasn't the case. Our Morgan Chesky, my colleague Morgan Chesky, has spent the day talking to people on Sanibel Island who have been evacuated. One woman told him that she left in the past but didn't do it this time because she just didn't think the storm surge would be that bad. So across the board, Hallie, that really is the thing, that people are underestimating this, and they just did not think that it would be as devastating as it's turned out to be.
We just heard from Governor Ron DeSantis, as we've been on the air here, who issued this new warning to people, basically saying you got to maintain law and order, et cetera. Talk about that piece of it and what we're hearing on that front.
Yeah, you know, he's given a couple of news briefings today. One earlier, he kind of quoted what he said was written on the plywood that somebody used to board up a business, saying that it was written, "You loot, we shoot." Essentially making the point that he doesn't want people to go out, doesn't want people to loot, but also that there could be consequences on the other side of that as well. You know, making allusions to the fact that Florida is a Second Amendment state. You know, we also know that in a number of the briefings that his office has put out, they've talked about the fact that they have peace officers out to enforce that, to look out for looters and to make sure that people aren't going into businesses and taking things in the aftermath of this storm.
Real quick, Blaine, Sanibel Island, you just mentioned our colleague Morgan Chesky was there. Fort Myers, really intense storm surge there. Different, did they feel like, from other storms they've seen before?
You know, one person that Morgan spoke to says that she wrote out Irma. That's something that she said, you know, of course, powerful, hit a few years ago. And she stayed and she didn't have to abandon. So she said, hey, if I could do that, then I can be here for Ian. That's not the case. That's something that shows that this is certainly different than what people have seen before. And I think it speaks to what folks said earlier, that they just really thought they could do this. A lot of the people said, this is Florida. Hurricanes are certainly not something that's foreign, but this, because of the storm surge, really caught a lot of people by surprise, Hallie.
Blaine Alexander, thank you so much for being down there for us. Appreciate it. And thank you all for watching this hour of, again, continuous coverage here of that storm that has hit the eastern and the southern part of the United States. We're going to have more for you here Monday, same time, same place. See you then.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.